Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day. Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg. Now, Jacob, every fortnight when I'm briefing your fellow columnist, as it were, Nicky Morgan, we ask what should she write about this week? And I always fall back on saying, I think you better write about the thing being this concentrated mass of Brexit, the Conservative Party, whatever's happening in Parliament and the state of the negotiations. So I will ask you in a few moments about the thing. But I've got a couple of preliminary questions first, just to sort of get out of the way. In fact, saying get out of the way sounds rather trivial in the context of the Labour conference, which is pretty serious business. What do you make of it all so far?
Well, I think Tony Blair was right when he said that the current leadership of the Labour Party is the most left-wing, and from a Conservative point of view, the most dangerous in the history of the Labour Party, that they are hardline, real, believing socialists, and they have taken control of the party, and some pretty unpleasant things have been going on in the party. The anti-Semitism is real and has frightened the Jewish community in a very unpleasant way, a very worrying way, and brought something into British politics that I never thought I was likely to see in this generation, that indeed didn't even occur to me that it would be an issue. So I think there are some very unpleasant undertones to the Labour Party at the moment.
On the infamous second referendum and all that, I mean, obviously it suits the Conservative Party to say Labour want to revisit it and defy the people, but isn't what we're learning there in a complete mess? I mean, yesterday they seem to have composited a motion that's in favour of a second referendum in a rather vague way. And this morning up pops John McDonnell saying, oh, well, no, it doesn't mean a second referendum with the option of staying in the EU. Oh, no, it's a second referendum on the deal or nothing. This is a mess, isn't it?
Yes, it is. There's as much division in the Labour Party on the European question as there is within the Tory party. The Eurosceptic wing of the Labour Party is smaller, but look at Jeremy Corbyn's voting record, that he was in the division lobbies with Bill Cash consistently over the new treaties and further powers for the European Union. And the socialist critique of the European Union has always been that it's a capitalist plot and it stops them doing full-blooded socialist things. So inevitably there is a muddle, but it perhaps also comes from the Labour Party's electoral dynamic, that a large number of its seats are metropolitan, are strongly pro-European, have some of the highest Remain votes in the country, and then it's got some of the seats with the highest Leave vote in the country, particularly in the Midlands and north of England. And that's a great conundrum for them electorally, that they risk alienating their traditional base if they are too Remainy. On the other hand, they risk alienating their new base if they stick with a Leave position that they put forward in their manifesto last year.
Corbyn seems to me to have handled this with consummate and professional cynicism over the weekend. When asked, what's your position on a second referendum, he said, well, of course, if the conference instructs me to do this plainly, I'm going to listen. But the way the motion's been composited, it's done no such thing as he would have known when he was giving that answer.
But isn't it funny that we're back to talking about composite motions, that this is so much the Labour Party of the 1980s, and the conference getting its teeth into things and the leadership trying to work out what the conference is going to do and getting compromises on policy that way rather than getting a clear sense of direction.
I'm veering onto the topic I meant to put off for a bit, but do you see any prospect at all that this rump, it's probably quite a large rump of Blairite and Brownite MPs, could peel away in the event of any deal from Jeremy Corbyn and support the Prime Minister?
It's a very interesting proposition. Can the Prime Minister get a coalition in Parliament that loses a large number of the Conservative Party, but gains in return the Blairite wing of the Labour Party? I think it's quite difficult. I think it's difficult for a number of reasons. One is that the Conservative Party is probably more united than it seems on everything other than Europe, and that the numbers who are with the Blairites and passionately want us to remain are quite small. So the real backers of that plan will be quite a small percentage of the parliamentary party. The other is that the Blairites are very well aware of what happened in the 1980s, and they think that if they split the Labour Party, then the Conservative Party remains in office for the best part of 20 years. And I think those two things make it very hard. But for those of us who like political history, it's a very interesting speculation. And I think, sorry to carry on, but I think had the EU given more of a welcome to Chequers, this was something it was worth thinking about quite seriously. I think the fact that the EU snubbed Chequers and snubbed the Prime Minister pretty directly makes it much less likely, because you'd now be splitting both parties over something that doesn't have much of following in the continent.
Also, it's harder to see, I think, Labour MPs voting for a Canadian-type proposal, which may well be where we're going, we'll come back to that in a moment, than even a halfway house proposal like Chequers. Just while we're on the subject of what goes on in the Commons, I just wanted to try a quick question on you about a column Alex Morton of the Centre for Policy Studies wrote for us last week, which was arresting, made me think, and I wondered why no one else had seen the point, which was that he wrote about evil. I don't mean evil as in deliver us from, I mean English votes for English laws. And Alex said in effect, why is there this presumption that a Conservative government can't get legislation through when after Brexit, much of it will be, or could be, English-based legislation? And he gave the example of grammar schools, for example. I mean, we're told there's no majority for grammars in the Commons for relaxing the present restrictions or setting up new ones. But Alex pointed out the government's got an effective majority in England of 60.
It doesn't matter, there's double lock. The whole point of eval is that it has to be passed both by majority in England and by majority in the United Kingdom Parliament.
Alex's argument was that at the very last, English MPs have the power to vote down any amendments passed by
That's
UK
right.
MPs as a whole, or to blow out the whole bill on third reading. And he asked how likely this would be on, say, grammar schools.
Well, the United Kingdom MPs can vote on any report stage amendment, and it has to be passed by both the totality of MPs and by English MPs. So it gets blocked at that point by the UK MPs. So they don't have to stop it all at third reading. There is a double vote. It's not done as a double vote. It's done as a single vote, but it's counted twice, with the English MPs counting in one column and the United Kingdom MPs counting in another column.
Just to go back to where I was, though, I think Alex's point was at third reading, the Grand Committee, in other words, MPs for English seats, have the power to undo these amendments.
Well, they have the power to block the whole bill.
And to block the whole bill.
But they can't take out the amendments and expect the bill then to go through at third reading, can they? Because if the English MPs amend a bill in a way that the totality of MPs will not accept, the totality of MPs will block the whole bill. English votes for English laws is one of the untidiest bits of the standing orders. It doesn't really create English votes for English laws. It creates a potential English veto for English laws, but it's basically irrelevant because, as they're standing orders, any government that didn't have a majority of English MPs and was therefore likely to lose these votes would simply change the standing orders.
Would that depend on the view of the Speaker?
No.
Well, they can simply
simply change standing orders.
Yeah.
That it doesn't help the government having a majority in England. The Scottish nationalists historically take the view that they will not vote on exclusively English matters, but then they do because
Yes.
they're an opposition party. And so I just don't think the argument's right, and I don't think it's how the standing orders work.
Let's get back to Brexit,
Okay.
or finally turn to Brexit. Today, there's a meeting of the Cabinet. By tomorrow, doubtless, as is the way of these things, we'll know a certain amount of what went on in it. Just first of all, on the point of immigration.
By tomorrow? I'm surprised at your
You won't be
patience.
heard till tomorrow. The Cabinet leak will be out today, but Con Home, in its honourable way, will not be leaking its interview with you, but will keep it for tomorrow morning. So the first opportunity you will have to comment on it in public is then.
Yes.
So we read in the Times this morning, and the story looked at least plausible, that Sajid Javid is saying, well, I'm not going to be able to do anything to restrict or change EU migration until after the transition period. I think he was saying that he can't for a few more months afterwards. And my reading of that was that there was an implicit blame in it from him on the previous regime at the Home Office not getting its ducks in a row in time. Whether I'm right or wrong, what did you think when you read this?
Actually, I'm relatively relaxed about this. That one of the things to bear in mind is that if we leave on well trade terms, we're in control of our own implementation period. And if it takes us a few extra weeks or extra months to put in a different line at Heathrow for EU nationals to come through, then that's a matter for us. It's a decision we will have taken, and the terms of their coming will be a decision that we have taken. Because it'd be perfectly reasonable for us to say European nationals can keep on coming in, but they do not establish permanent rights to stay.
You've just referred to under world trade terms, yeah. But if you don't have world trade terms and you have a deal, you presumably have the transition.
But the transition period has already been agreed.
Sure.
That rights would be established in the interim period. I happen to think that was a mistake and the government shouldn't have given that away. But that's already been given away. That's not, it's not particularly the previous incumbent's fault. It's something the government decided. If it's anyone's fault, it's the Prime Minister's, because she agreed to do that.
So a few extra months to you really doesn't make a significant difference in the event of a deal, in the event of transition.
The Eurosceptics within the party, people linked to the ERG, have always been accused of never having compromised. One of the biggest compromises we made was to accept the transition period when we were paying over a great deal of money and allowing free movement rights to continue to be established. We accepted that some months ago, and we're not going back on that. If we leave on world trade terms without an agreement, then I think it should be different. I think we should say people can carry on coming freely because we're not going to put in new queues at Heathrow overnight, but that they don't establish permanent rights of residency for themselves and for their families.
But having already accepted transition, you're not bothered about a few more months on top of the transition?
Well, the transition shouldn't go beyond the 31st of December 2020, which is the date it's meant to end. After that, there must be time for the Home Office to have systems in place. And if there isn't, that's the fault of the current Home Secretary. Can't blame it on his predecessor. That's 2 years away. The wheels grind fine, and they grind slow, but not that slow. Well, they don't necessarily grind very fine at the Home Office.
Exceeding slow, but not necessarily very fine. And now, just panning the camera back for a moment, where are we after Salzburg?
Well, one of the really exciting things about today is the IEA launched Anchor Singham's paper on how you could have what Boris calls a super Canada deal. and that's gaining a lot of support. It ties in with the paper the RG published on how you solve the Irish border question from the EU's point of view, which interestingly has been made easier by Barnier saying that if there were a border down the Irish Sea, then technological solutions could be used from the Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Well, if they can be used for Great Britain to Northern Ireland, they can surely be used for the United Kingdom to the Republic of Ireland. That must follow logically. That's a crucial concession from him, which I don't think enough has been made of. Tie this in with the IEA paper of the trade policy we could have, the benefits that would come from that. Canada becomes supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
One of the points about a Canada solution really has seemed to me to be this, that from the start, some of you, well, some of us actually too, said this Chequers proposal won't be acceptable to the EU. They don't like the complicated customs arrangement. They think the separation of services and manufacturing messes up the single market. In fact, Chequers tramples all over the precious four freedoms, and however polite they're being, they're going to reject it. Canada boils all the problems down, apparently, it seems, to one, namely the backstop, the customs arrangement, and the regulatory arrangements between the EU and the UK. But there is an issue here, isn't there, which is this. This is not the only reason why the Prime Minister went with Chequers. She went with Chequers because a significant section of the Cabinet, headed by the Chancellor, prefer a solution that leans more towards Norway and keeps us as close to the single market and frictionless trade as possible. So, although the winds are blowing in the direction of Canada, as it were, there's going to be surely a ferocious fight back from the same people who brought about part of Chequers in the first place.
Well, the Chancellor and the Treasury have consistently opposed Brexit and have come up with completely bogus forecasts to try and make that case, and have really shamed the Treasury with the way that they have used a great institution of the state for cheap and ineffective political propaganda. And that's a pity, and it's undistinguished of the Treasury to have behaved in this way, particularly when George Osborne set up the Office for Budget Responsibility on the basis that nobody trusted Treasury figures. And so I think you have to bear that in mind with anything the Treasury is doing, by its political axis and what it's determined to do. And therefore I think your analysis is gentle, that you're saying they want a Norway-style deal. Basically, they don't want us to leave the European Union, and they're fighting a rearguard action to stop the referendum result. And I think this is a mistake, and it's up to the Prime Minister to give a clear lead. The issue that they seem to be complaining about is just-in-time delivery, but you have just-in-time delivery across international borders outside the European Union.
You keep saying they. Don't you actually mean he, namely the Chancellor? And shouldn't he be fired?
It's not for me to say who the Prime Minister should advise the Queen to appoint to the Cabinet, but I do, of course, mean the Chancellor. The Chancellor is the head of the, well, he's technically number two, isn't he? He's the second Lord of the Treasury, but he is in charge of the Treasury. And yes, of course, I mean the person who leads the organisation. The person who leads the organisation must take responsibility.
What will the Prime Minister do you think, at conference? I mean, last Friday she wrapped herself in the flag. I don't mean that pejoratively, necessarily, and said she'd been treated very badly. It's now up to the EU to come forward with a proposal. I mean, is that sustainable to run that, as it were, all the way to conference? Or would she not be better off getting up and saying, look, I've tried. Goodness knows I've tried with Chequers. I've attempted as best I can to meet them halfway. But it's pretty clear now that the only possible solution on the table, which the Commons might vote for, and which I have not ruled out, is some form of amended Canadian deal.
slightly the line that I have surrendered to the EU, but they will only accept unconditional surrender, and this partial surrender has not been acceptable. I think it would be sensible to try and move to a Super Canada approach.
At the conference?
At the conference, or before the conference, or possibly after today's cabinet meeting. The question is, does it command support? Does it command support in the country, and does it command support in Parliament? And perhaps to this extent, what the Prime Minister has done over the last couple of months has been helpful and informative, because she has gone much further than I think reasonable in offering the EU everything that it wants, basically making us a vassal state in key areas. And the EU's rejected that and said, no, we're not allowing you out on the other areas at this point. And that's shown a lot of people who were nervous about a Canada-style deal, that they thought it wasn't close enough, that a closer deal must be very difficult. And the question is whether there are enough of them now to make a majority in the House of Commons, and whether faced with the choice of a Canada-style deal or no deal, people would say, well, a Canada-style deal is the best option. And I think that's quite likely, but you can't be certain about Commons votes until they happen.
When you say people, I think you must be thinking, I'm certainly thinking of, let's call them the soft Brexiteers, that the PM could go to them and make claims that may not stand up. Namely, if you bring this down, there'll be a general election. Might well not be a general election. And so I can see you looking very sceptical of that claim.
Which Conservative MP is going to vote for this general election? Unless you've got a majority of 30,000, I think you'd be looking over your shoulder thinking this may not be such a good idea.
But you could also go to them if you were the Prime Minister and say something that's rather more credible, like, look, if this doesn't go through, you're going to have no deal. Yeah, and that might or might not concentrate the minds wonderfully. But at which point, some of them will think, no, if we vote this thing down, we can somehow force the postponement of Article 50.
The parliamentary mechanisms do not allow for that.
Well, an interesting question. I've been asking around to try and find out how could you possibly postpone Article 50, given the points you've already made, often in these modcasts, of much of the necessary legislation now being in place. And I put this to another Brexiteer, Member of Parliament, who said, he said, well, what I do is I would keep attempting, and if you have the numbers, getting Parliament to pass vote after vote after vote after vote,
but
calling for...
This ignores the key point, that the government controls the parliamentary timetable.
It controls the timetable, but there are all sorts of opportunities for votes, aren't there? Opposition day motions and the like.
How many opposition days have we had?
Isn't the question how many opposition days could you have?
How many opposition days they're entitled to in a session? They're entitled to 20. We've had 17 of them. We could have the final 3 all after the 29th of March next year and meet standing orders requirements.
So we've got to watch to see if they're using up their opposition days between now and that date. It's clearly an interesting thing to do.
Absolutely. There are only 3 left. Backbench business days are in the control of the government.
Is there any other means of bringing a vote to the floor of the Commons, other than the government moving one?
Well,
other than
Standing Order 24, but Standing Order 24 specifically states that it must be a take-note motion. There's no ability in standing orders to give a substantive motion under Standing Order 24. So that doesn't work. You can amend legislation, but the government hasn't got much legislation, and the amendment has to be within the scope of the legislation. So you can't amend the driverless cars bill or whatever we've got left going through to say we must join a customs union or we must rescind Article 50. That would simply be out of scope.
It's the Speaker who decides what is and what isn't eligible for a Standing Order 24 debate, isn't it?
It is, but Standing Order 24 sets out the terms of the motion.
Of course.
It's an unamendable motion of a take no kind.
What happens if day after day, and this is not beyond my imagination at least, the Speaker allows vote after vote on an SO24 take note motion, and you have the Commons continuously voting, expressing its view that the date of Brexit should be put off?
But it won't be expressing a view. All it can do is say, we have not taken note.
Technically, but
the
if you're reading the newspapers.
The technicality is very important. Well, what are you voting on? See, the government would abstain on these motions. The government would not vote to take note against cranks voting not to take note, because voting not to take note of something doesn't make any sense. So there's the one option is that any government would always make time for a vote of no confidence. And then you say to people, do you really want a general election?
Yes, I can see
I
how,
think that is
the argument goes, and that's the ultimate form of pressure on the soft Brexiteers, or indeed on anyone else.
So the parliamentary issue is, does the government want to deliver on its plan? If it does, it can stop any other plan being put forward, leaving the choice of its plan or no plan at all. That's not going to be easy. It'll be politically difficult. For me to sit here and say, well, they'll lose vote after vote and it doesn't matter, is true constitutionally. But it's harder than that politically, of course. You're right on that. But a strong government that wishes to tough it out would be able to do so.
Is it conceivable to you that the government headed by this Prime Minister might seek to postpone the date of leaving the...
No. I think it would be something that could not command majority support of the Conservative Parliamentary Party or the country at large. I think the country at large would be outraged if this were done.
And just finally finishing off with the famous so-called second referendum. I mean, this is very easy to see, even from a distance, that there surely isn't time now, regardless of the merits of the argument, to put a bill through for a second referendum on anything at all before now, March 29th.
I would have thought it was extremely difficult to do, that the Electoral Commission would want more time than could be provided to make the preparations. The parliamentary timetable will be quite tight. It's going to be very tight to get any withdrawal arrangement through Parliament by March the 29th, let alone trying to get a referendum bill through. So yes, I think you're right. I think the argument about a second referendum is really an argument about, do you want to remain in the European Union? And they use that as code because they're not brave enough to say that what they really want is to reverse the decision.
Furthermore, surely there's another reason why this won't happen, but I need to put it to you in the form of a question that you've just said. I can't imagine the government seeking to postpone Article 50. Well, you wouldn't get a referendum bill through without the support of the government. And can you really imagine Theresa May turning around and supporting a second referendum before March 29th?
Well, again, I think the country would not want it, and the parliamentary party would split, and the Prime Minister wishes to remain Prime Minister and carry on leading the country and not lead us into a chaotic situation, which I think Tory party suddenly advocating a second referendum would create.
So what do you think this campaign is really all about? Because the people who are running it are intelligent people. They must know there's practically no time for this, and they must know that the Prime Minister's not going to support it.
They campaign to remain, they don't want to leave, and they want to stop us leaving. That's what it's all about.
But they don't have a practicable means of stopping us leaving.
They use the referendum as a cuddly term for something that is actually intended to be an overthrow of the vote of June 2016. So they say we'll have a second referendum, we must go back to the people again, because they think that if people vote often enough, one day they'll get the right answer, and then they won't be so keen on future votes. None of these people would be asking for a second referendum if Remain had won.
And that didn't happen. So all in all, you're convinced Brexit's going to happen on the due date?
As long as the government remains the government, Brexit will happen on the due date. The government is in a position to be able to deliver that, and I don't think can deliver anything else.
Well, on that cheerful note for our Brexiteer listeners,
Which makes up the majority of your listeners or my listeners, I think.
I suspect it does. Thank you very much. We're now going to go off to the IEA launch, which will of course be ancient history by tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.
Great pleasure as always, thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.